Chris Cuomo is praising Joe Rogan and blasting his former network over its COVID coverage. In the podcast with Patrick Bet-David, the former CNN anchor and brother of former New York Governor Andrew Cuomo shared that he's now taking the same drug he used to make fun of. That's right. Let's watch.
I'll tell you something else that's going to get you a lot of hits. I am taking a, what do they call it? Like a regular dose, you know, whatever. They're trying to build up of ivermectin. Ivermectin was a boogeyman early on in COVID.
You couldn't talk about it.
That was wrong. We were given bad information about ivermectin. The real question is why? Everyone's going to say Joe Rogan was right. No, Joe Rogan was saying, yeah, he was right. But that's not what matters. What matters is the entire clinical community knew that ivermectin couldn't hurt you. They knew it, Patrick. I know they knew it. How do I know? Because now I'm doing nothing but talking to these clinicians who at the time were overwhelmed by COVID and they weren't saying anything.
As a reminder, this is the way Chris Cuomo talked about ivermectin in 2020, as ex-influencer Maze Moore pointed out.
People who are injecting drugs for animals and horse.
And people telling them to.
Oh, my God.
What person? You know, you talk about cancel culture and who to shame. Ivermectin, a dewormer, really?
They are shaming themselves. No one has to shame them. They're shaming themselves.
No, they need to be shamed.
Yeah.
They need to be called out and shamed, brother.
Now, Joe Rogan reacted to Cuomo's shift in positions on his podcast. Let's take a listen.
Chris Cuomo just came out and said he's got a vaccine injury. That guy was pushing that on TV forever. And he said he got it with his first dose, and then he got it again with his second dose.
Rogan goes on to criticize the New York Times for their recent reporting on COVID vaccine-related injuries.
This is in New York Times. Thousands believe COVID vaccines harm them. Is anyone listening? All vaccines have at least occasional side effects, but people who say they were injured by COVID vaccines believe their cases have been ignored. Well, they have. They have been ignored. I have friends that have been ignored.
Now, many on the right were furious with Cuomo's admitted reversal. Author and ex-influencer John Lefevre said, quote, "It wasn't that Chris Cuomo was lied to about ivermectin or that Joe Rogan was lucky, as he now claims. Chris Cuomo was wrong. He was lazy. He didn't do his job. He was a useful idiot, repeating propaganda talking points, asking zero questions, and shaming anyone who did." Meanwhile, other CNN watchers are mad at Cuomo for different reasons. For example, one ex-user exchanged tweets with Cuomo writing, "Wow, just wow, it's always something with you. So glad CNN fired you. I watched you suffer with COVID and you have long COVID. Now all of a sudden, now you have issues related to the vaccine. Come on, man." Remember this, Chris Cuomo got COVID early on and shared the news of his illness on TV at CNN.
The virus wants us to lay down. The virus wants us to take it. Other than the blessed few, the rest of us who get this are going to have an experience unlike anything else they've ever had.
And of course, his brother Andrew was then governor of New York and became famous for daily briefings about COVID, and then famous for some other things.
Yeah, this is tough. I remember specifically a bit that they did where they each got giant Q-tips and were joking about the size of the Q-tip and the size of the brother's nose, and there was of this pageantry around it. And so no wonder people are upset about a reversal of sorts coming so late in the game and after so many people were, I think, trying in good faith to raise these kinds of concerns. The negativity about the vaccine injuries, for one, has always been kind of absurd and outsized. Believing that the cost, that the benefit outweighs the cost, and making that case to the American public is one thing. Denying that there are costs at all was, I think, a tipping point of how intolerant the public media space was for any kind of discourse at the time. Moreover, I think for even casual observers, the insistence on characterizing hydrochloroquine or ivermectin or whatever as horse tranquilizers. Remember when the FDA came out and said, you are not a horse, and kind of was joking about this characterization of it as taking an animal drug. Again, these are drugs that are prescribed to humans, and you can make a case that this is not indicated for this particular illness. These drugs are indicated for this particular illness without trying to cast people who are doing clinical trials to see if the drug has some efficacy and all these other kinds of things as insane and doing something that is outside of the scientific method and literally just eating dog food and acting crazy.
Right. I agree 100%. Just to add some things there. On the vaccine injury front, yeah, you're of course right. It could still be that vaccines are good, helpful for a lot of people, or even are worth it for all of society as a whole. Now, I think what we found out with the vaccine is that they're most important for people who are immunocompromised or fall into an elderly category who are more at risk of COVID. But there will be vaccine injuries, as there are with many other vaccines. Yes. And what my colleague at Reason Magazine, Christian Britschke, has written about this a lot. Actually, we should get him on the show to talk about it. He's looked at how the process for claiming a vaccine injury related to COVID has been made deliberately different from other vaccine injury processes by this kind of, and he can give more detail about it, the protections that were given to the makers of the COVID vaccines to protect them from liability on those fronts. And it's really hard for people who say they have a COVID vaccine injury to have their day in court. We should probably do a follow-up on that. I think it would be very interesting. And then on the ivermectin part, right, exactly. It was fine to say that, well, if you look at the totality of the studies on this issue, there are some studies that, show not much of a positive effect for these things. There are some studies that show a minor positive effect, but then it's, well, how rigorous was the study?
Right.
What were the other factors?
And causation.
Sure. It's hard to, but science is working through those processes. Sure. So the mistake of the CNNs of the world was, yes, to demonize this as dangerous. It's prescribed for humans. If you have a parasitic worm, that's what you take. If your animal has a parasitic worm, that's what it's prescribed for. So that was unnecessarily demagoguing this product.
Yeah, and I will say I have some empathy for people in the media sphere who were facing a lot of pressure to cover this and to cover it a certain way. I remember when I was doing my own show, my own podcast at the time, I chose to sit it out because I didn't want to be in a position where I was arguing for or against something that I was personally very ambivalent about. I was, living at home, working from home, living alone, didn't feel the same kind of urgency to get vaccinated as quickly as some other people. In DC, they had, when you were signing up to get the vaccine, they asked you what you did and who you came in contact with. And I was actually low down on their priority list because of all of the reasons that I just explained. So I was kind of late in the schedule. And part of that was looking at all the information that was coming in and having, I think, a healthy skepticism as someone who majored in the history of science about how this was all going to go. But also, I don't want to say to an audience when I don't know. I don't want to give advice in either direction. So I largely sat that out and only was forced to start talking about this stuff publicly when I joined Rising, after much of this had already abated. So I have some empathy for if you are on the news and you're forced to kind of take a side and you're at a network that was probably pressuring you and have a brother who's in a public health capacity as an elected official pressuring you to kind of say a certain kind of thing. I have some degree of empathy for that, but they didn't just kind of toe the line. They went out of their way to demagogue and cast kind of very personal aspersions on people who were asking, in retrospect, and to many people at the moment, very reasonable questions about what the scientific information that was coming out really said.
Yeah, and so much of that information had to be updated. It was experts giving their best guesses and best impressions based on the data they had that sometimes disagreed. There were smart people on different sides of, how important is this? How dangerous is it? Could this therapeutic work? There are people reaching, smart people, all of them reaching somewhat different conclusions, and then certainly different conclusions about what are the policy implications of that.
Yeah.
Who should people be required to get it? Should this this measure of crowd control versus this thing? That was all being worked through in real time, and the media had this, they'd pick their favorite expert and then bring that person on TV over and over again to often to demonize people who had a dissenting approach.
Remember,
it was so political.
It was a weirdly partisan moment in time, and I think that made a lot of people who were, good liberals feel like they couldn't say X. I remember talking to people like Jeffrey Sachs, who was kind of an early left-leaning person who pushed back against some of the narrative around lab leak theory. And I remember talking to some other kind of left-leaning people, sort of early in the lab leak stuff, maybe say like June, spring of 2021, and how isolated they felt and how difficult it was to say kind of the bare minimum about that particular issue. It really was a toxic environment. And I should say also, there's a corollary on the other side where I think to date there is a real resistance on the right to being open to conversations about injury from COVID itself, long COVID and the like. I think what's difficult about some of the vaccine injury versus long COVID injury conversation is that they're very similar symptoms and everyone's had both, right? So I hope that both sides are a little bit more open-minded about the extent to which they're arguing based on their priors and what their politics are. But I mean, I'm glad at the end of the day that the shift is happening with Cuomo and others. And I hope it allows for more open conversations to get to some kind of version of the truth and not just kind of a reshuffling of these deck chairs on the Titanic and a reshuffling of the teams.
Indeed. More Rising right after this.